A few words about the format of this meeting. We will listen to Professor Heschel's lecture, and there will be room for questions and answers. And at 4:30 there will be refreshments outside. So we'll finish the session here at 4:30, and there will be refreshments and possibility of chatting and mingling and perhaps talking a bit more with Professor Heschel afterwards. We have two very special guests today. We're so happy to have Christer Stendahl's family here, Britta and John Stendahl. It's great that you made it here this year. Christer Stendahl was bishop in this and privileged to introduce this year's speaker, Professor Susannah Heschel, who once was a student of Christer Stendahl at Harvard Divinity School, and Britta told me one of his favorite students, didn't you say so? And now Susannah Heschel is Ely Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. But presently she's in Berlin as a fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. And my first encounters with Professor Heschel was in her capacity as a feminist theologian and as someone who admonishes her Christian colleagues to take anti-Judaism in Christian feminist writings seriously. But your main research interest is the German theology, the development of German theology, Jewish Christians' relations in Germany during the 19th and 20th century, and that will also be the focus of your lecture now. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Is the microphone working? Yes? Yes, can you hear me? Is it all right? A little bit higher. How's this? Is that a little bit better? I think if it's moved up higher, then I think it's louder. Oh, yes, I think it should work now. Yes, is it? Tell me. Signal me if it isn't. All right? Bridget, tell me. It's for you. This lecture is for you. I'm very moved to be invited to Stockholm to deliver a lecture in memory of Christer Stendahl. He was a great man. And I would say that this is really extraordinary what he accomplished in a short period of time. He was with us on this earth for less than 100 years, but he did so much to transform the way we think as Jews and Christians about one another, the way we read the New Testament, the way we understand especially St. Paul, and the way also we think about the history of scholarship and the way our minds are sometimes deformed by scholarship. And I want to give you some examples. Of course, that marvelous book that everybody knows, on Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West. It's in the book Paul's Jews and Gentiles. Yeah? Paul amongst Jews and Gentiles. The Introspective Conscience of the West. How we think about scholarship, or the categories that scholarship develops, can sometimes alter in problematic ways the way we read Scripture. What kinds of questions do we ask as academics? And Christer Stendahl was somebody who saw very clearly that sometimes the scholarship itself deforms the text of the Bible and deforms the way we relate to one another. And that needs to be reconsidered. We have to think about the categories we bring to the text that we study. I learned so much from him, and I also am so grateful to him for what he did on behalf of women, not only here in this church, but of course on an international level. He was our ally. He was our hero. He spoke out on behalf of women long before we had very many allies in the Jewish community. And it was great to be able to turn to him for support and encouragement, and to use his arguments also on behalf of Jewish feminists, Jewish women. And then I have to just tell you, studying with Christer Stendahl in the Introduction to New Testament at Harvard Divinity School, where the room was full, everybody took that class, hundreds of students. I just want to tell you that it wasn't easy for him, because there were students who came in at age 22, 23, and their minds were already closed. They weren't open to new ways of thinking. He had a tough time with them, and they would listen, and it didn't always sink in. And they listened to what he said and they wrote it down on the paper, but yeah, it was very hard. He took on difficult challenges, the most important challenges of his lifetime. And we know, in part, some of the reasons why. We know what he witnessed in World War II. What he saw changed his life vis-a-vis Jews. To be a Christian at that point could never be the same for him. It was an extraordinary act of conscience and bravery on his part to take up the challenges of Christian theology based on what he had witnessed, and he did something extraordinary for which we all are eternally grateful, and his legacy will affect us, Jews and Christians, for the rest of time. I have to just tell you that there were some things that he said there were many things that he wrote with a sense of humor. And there's just one passage that I have to read you because it is, of course, my all-time favorite. Paul, he said, was arrogant. But he was so blatantly arrogant that one can somehow cope with it. He was always the greatest of sinners, the greatest of apostles, the greatest when it came to speaking in tongues, the greatest at having been persecuted. That is because he wasn't married. Or perhaps that is why he wasn't married. Nobody could stand him. But he was great, and that makes his battle with his weakness so moving on a quite personal level. And you know, when I read this, I can just hear him saying this in his wonderful accent. Yeah, it's so great. He was so great. Isn't that wonderful? And it's wonderful when a theologian has a sense of humor, don't you think? It doesn't happen often enough. So I'm so glad, Britta and John, it's an honor that you're here with us today. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I would like to say how much I appreciate Christopher Stendhal's work because I have studied the history of New Testament scholarship in the 19th century and the 20th century. So I want to tell you a little bit about what I've looked at. And then I want to also bring in something else, which is that I'm now writing a book on the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam. Because some of the same Jewish scholars who were writing about Christian origins and writing about the history of Judaism also worked on Islam. And in fact, the field of Islamic studies in Germany came to be dominated by Jewish scholars because the Christians in Germany weren't so interested in Islam in the 19th century especially. You know what they were interested in? India. Why were they interested in India? We talked about this morning, to find the roots of the Aryan soul. You know? Jewish scholars weren't. They had a different agenda altogether. So I want to talk then also about how Islam can possibly help us in a constructive way in our relations as Jews and Christians. And then I would like us to ask together and hear also what you have to say about ways in which what Bo Sandal and I were talking about earlier, the ways in which Christians and Jews have something to offer one another theologically. What do we have? What do you have as Christians to offer Judaism on a theological level, and what do we have that can be helpful to you? So let me begin by speaking briefly about modern Jewish scholarship on Christianity, where it comes from, what it was all about, and what happened to that scholarship. I began by studying Abraham Geiger, who was one of the main figures of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, a scholarly study of Judaism in Germany in the 19th century. He was, in addition, a leading rabbi within the liberal movement of Judaism, very famous for that work, and he was a very prolific scholar. He could never get a professorship in Germany because the Jews couldn't become professors in the first half of the 19th century. So he worked as a rabbi and he undertook a scholarship on the side, so to speak. His first book was a study of the Quran. He examined the parallels between passages in the Quran and passages in rabbinic literature. That is, the stories of the Bible are retold in the Quran, but not in the same way as they appear in the Bible. As you know, we've all read these passages. And so for a long time, Christian scholars, that Muhammad was influenced by Christian heretics. And they told him the wrong stories, because they were heretics. This is what heretics do. And he wrote them down. Then comes Geiger, and he said, no. The way these biblical stories are told in the Quran is the same way they're told in the Midrash, Jewish rabbinic literature, and he showed the parallels. Not only in the Midrash, but even in the Mishnah itself, the earliest, most important part of the Talmud, parallels, almost identical or with a very slight change. And of course, we all know very many parallels in ritual practice and religious law between Judaism and Islam. This was Geiger's first book, and it was hailed all over Europe as a very important breakthrough in scholarship on Islam. Also, by the way, Geiger speaks about Muhammad in very positive terms, not as a hypocrite, but as a religious enthusiast who believed he had an important religious message to bring. Now, Geiger thinks that the message of Islam is simply the message of Jewish monotheism brought to the Arab pagans, not a new religion. That book was a great success. Then, 30 years later, Geiger said the same thing about the New Testament. He pointed out that passages in Jesus' teachings are the same passages you find in rabbinic literature. We know this already, right? We know what he said, that Jesus was a Pharisee. You've heard this before. Actually, I just realized Gustav Lindeskog was from Sweden. Do you know that name? Yeah, I just realized that because I read his book on the history of Jewish scholarship on Jesus many years ago. Isn't it so nice to be here? Yeah, he was in Uppsala, I think. Yes? Yeah, oh, that's so nice. Okay. So he said that Jesus was a Pharisee, and Lindeskog wrote about this. That's why it came to me at this moment. Jesus was a Pharisee. The New Testament passages have parallels in rabbinic literature and even some of the debates that Jesus has with the Pharisees, or debates that the Pharisees had with one another, some of the discussions in the Gospels, and he compares some of the differences in the synoptics within a given story, how there's some stories are told differently. Same thing, he finds the parallels. But this time, it was one thing to say it about the Quran. But to say it about the New Testament, then he got in trouble. And Geiger was attacked for this on all sides by Protestant theologians who read his work. First of all, the parallels, they said, were superficial. It may be that Jesus said some of the same things the rabbi said, but Adolf von Harnack said, the rabbi said so much more besides, so that with them, the message was darkened, distorted, and rendered ineffective by 1,000 other things that the rabbis also said. And with Jesus, he says, the spring came up fresh. That's Harnack. Earlier, Franz Delitzsch said, to compare Jesus to the Pharisees is to me 10 times more horrific than the crucifixion. Can you imagine? That's 10 times, crucifixion, 10 times more horrific. This, frankly, I think is inappropriate. If I were a Christian, I don't know. I would say such a thing, but okay. At any rate, he was condemned for making these parallels, and the problem was simply this. If Jesus said nothing new, what was original? What was unique? What's different about the Christian message? Now, the Jewish argument was consistent in the 19th century that Jesus did not intend to found a new religion. It was Paul who took the message of Jesus and brought it to the Greco-Roman pagan world, and they mixed it up with pagan ideas, and that's how the doctrines and dogma of Christianity merged. So that Christianity is not the faith of Jesus, but the religion about Jesus. Geiger suggests if the faith of Jesus was Pharisaic religion, which for him was a liberal, progressive development in first century Judaism, where would you find it today? Modern Reform Judaism is a liberal Judaism that's trying to restore and revive Pharisaic religion. If you want the faith of Jesus, where would you find it today? In Reform Judaism. You want to be a Christian? Have the faith of Jesus? What should you do? Become a Reformed Jew. This was not very well received at the time, but okay. Now, what interests me in all of this, first of all, is the problem that this kind of argument posed, first of all, to Christian theologians, how they responded to it. But I'm also interested in another phenomenon, another aspect of this, which is the way that Jewish thinkers have used the figure of Jesus to express Jewish concerns. And I find it very striking. The Jews, in some sense, are using the Jesus story, not the doctrines of Christianity, the story of Jesus as a figure to symbolize Jewish historical experience. One finds it in the arguments of Geiger. One finds it later in the work, for example, of Marc Chagall in his crucifixion paintings, or in the work of certain poets, including Zionist poets, or H.V. Greenberg, among others, in even representations of the Holocaust, that the figure of Jesus comes to stand for Jewish suffering. Who was crucified? You know the famous scene in Elie Wiesel's book, Night, where they're watching three children, young boys, being hanged, yes, at Auschwitz, and the one who is very small in the middle and takes a long time to die, to hang. Yeah? And someone says, "Where is God?" And someone else says, "There he is hanging on the gallows." And again, a crucifixion scene. And all of its complexity, in other words, Judaism is using Christianity to understand itself, to express itself, to define itself. And in some ways, too, Jewish thinkers used Islam in the modern period, again, as a template to define and defend Jewish interests. Jesus is a figure to express Jewish historical experience of persecution. Islam is used to defend central elements of Jewish religion. That is, in the scholarship on Islam that was accompanying the 19th century, scholarship by Jewish thinkers, what was emphasized was always the origins of Islam from Judaism, the monotheism of Islam, strict monotheism, the rejection of anthropomorphism, and the centrality of ethics and religious law. That law is not contrary to religion. Law is part of religion, is an expression of religion, is religious itself. Now, why are they emphasizing those aspects of Islam while ignoring certain other aspects? They emphasize them because these are precisely what they find in Judaism and what they want to hold up to the European Christian world as good about Judaism. It's difficult for Jews to defend Judaism directly in the 19th century. Doing it indirectly was somehow, they felt, more palatable and would be more palatable to Christians. Keep something else in mind. I didn't get a very good look at the synagogue today here in Stockholm. I looked, but I didn't have the distance. But it seemed to me that there were certain windows that had the way the windows were shaped looked a little bit Moorish to me. Is that possible?
Yes. Yes.
Let me ask you something. Why would you do this? If you're a Jew living in Europe, in Germany, let's say, in the 19th century, there's plenty of, let's say, unfriendliness vis-a-vis Jews and Judaism, and you want to assimilate, and you want to fit in and integrate. Why would you build a synagogue in Moorish architecture? Why would you do that? It's not a...
It was a style. Everybody was doing it in Florence and in Germany and in Stockholm and
synagogues, and in the United States.
Reds and oranges and yellows. And,
yes.
And these were the colors of the sun.
Colors of the sun, that's nice. They're not all that color, but yes, it is nice to have colors of the sun. Yeah, Jews are building synagogues in Moorish architecture. Again, if Jews built it in Gothic, which they didn't do, the Gothic would swallow the Jewish. The Gothic is Christian, and it would look like a church. You can't have Gothic architecture to mean anything other than Christianity. Yeah? Romanesque occasionally they used for synagogues, but predominantly it was Moorish. There is no sort of Jewish architecture that stands out, but Moorish architecture was because it was perfectly comfortable for Jews to identify Judaism with Islam as the great monotheistic religions, yeah? These two. And in that sense, part of a polemic against Christianity for betraying monotheism with the Trinity. That was part of the Jewish agenda. And part of it was that there were no Muslims around at the time. One didn't know much about it, but in a sense that, look, we Jews have produced these great religions. Islam brought Jewish monotheism to the Arab pagans. But that leads us to another question. How do Jews explain the fact that Christianity was, let's say, departed from the monotheism, according to Jewish thinkers, with the Christology and with the Trinity, whereas Islam is very, very strictly monotheistic, very strictly so. Some of this is explained by these Jewish scholars by arguing that Christianity rose at a time when Judaism was disintegrating. In the Hellenistic period, Judaism was not strong. It was falling apart. It was fractionalized. There were Sadducees and Pharisees and Essenes and Zealots. The Romans were in Palestine. Everything was a mess. Whereas Islam arose at a time when the Talmud was completed, Jewish law was established, the rabbinic authority was established, Judaism was strong, and therefore Islam arose at a moment of Judaism's religious height, and it preserved, therefore, Jewish monotheism in a strict way. So Islam, to some sense, one might say, is the favorite child of the mother. And they spoke often of each other as a mother-daughter religions. Yes, Judaism gave birth to both, but Islam is the favored in that sense. And it's striking, and I think it's important for us to keep in mind this positive Jewish appreciation for Islam that existed well into the 1930s. And I emphasize it because everybody here is aware of what is said these days about Islam, including in the Jewish community, certainly in the United States, where Islam is identified as a piece of pathology that's simply violent and anti-Semitic at its core. And I'm sure you're familiar with that discussion. Yes? So I want to emphasize that the contrary is what was being argued at the time. There is one other problem with all of this, and that is, if Judaism is claiming Jesus as a Jewish figure and claiming that he taught nothing new, but simply the standard teachings of rabbis such as Hillel, how do Christian theologians respond? What are they to say to this? And here is the problem. In the 1860s, the response was to say that while it's true that Jesus spoke the same words as the rabbis, his religious consciousness, his religious subjectivity was different, and it was unique. Now that's a tricky argument. When you make an argument for uniqueness, essentially you're departing from historicism. Historical writing always says we have to contextualize, we have to compare, we put things in a setting. To speak of something unique, that's a problem. And then a category of subjectivity is also something that can't be well examined by scholars writing 2,000 years later. What can we say about Jesus' subjectivity? That's a difficult claim to make that can't really be investigated, evaluated, verified, or falsified. That's a problem. But at the same time, in the late 19th century, there were other Christian theologians who argued that while Jesus may have been Jewish in certain ways in terms of his teaching, there are other ways in which he was different from Judaism, not his subjectivity, but rather his race. In some sense, the two are two peas in a pod. His subjectivity, his soul, is unique, special, different, not Jewish, or his race is different, not Jewish. He was Aryan, they argued. Sometimes they'll say he was Galilean, and maybe you know the work of Sean Frayne, who's also pointed out that Galilean really meant Aryan, code word. Yeah. You know him, Sean Frayne from Dublin. Why make an argument that Jesus was Aryan? Why make that argument in the first place? The problem is, it seems to me, that there is these people, these theologians, first of all, want to recognize something unique about Christianity, something different. And they also recognize the problem that there is, for them, too much Judaism within Christianity. That is, even to affirm Jesus as Christ, Jesus as Messiah, you're affirming something Jewish. What does a Messiah come from? Old Testament. It's very hard, in other words, to speak in Christian language and get rid of the Judaism within Christianity. It's inside, not outside, not different. It's inside. One may speak of supersessionism, that Judaism is overcome, taken to another level, something new. It's never gotten rid of. And this was the dilemma. They began to recognize how much Judaism existed within Christianity. What to do about it? One of the debates that emerged had to do with the Old Testament. Should Christians have an Old Testament in their Bible? Isn't it a Jewish book? And what about Jesus? Was he really Jewish? How can Germans have a Jewish Messiah? There was a bestseller at the turn of the century that talked about Jesus didn't come from Palestine. He came from Schleswig-Holstein. And that's what was really popular. Not Arthur Draves, who said he never existed. No. It was really redefining who he was. Now, this movement to redefine Jesus as an Aryan began to take shape already at the early part of the century. This is before Hitler came to power. But of course, once Hitler came to power, they got very excited, these theologians, because now they felt they had a political base for their theological agenda. I want to tell you two things. One is about the actual practical measures that they took, and the other is, why would theologians be attracted to racial theory? What is it? So on the first point, what did they do about it? Maybe I published a book called The Aryan Jesus. I discovered that, in fact, in 1939, a group of theologians got together and established an institute for the study and eradication of Jewish influence on German religious life. For those of you who know German, Institut zur Erforschung und Beseitigung des jüdischen Einflusses auf die Soziologie. So Beseitigung is the crucial word. They got together, there were about 60 professors of theology, and by the way, you know that Hugo Odeberg was part of this institute, a very active member. I looked at his materials at the University of Lund some years ago when I visited Sweden, and Odeberg not only was involved giving lectures, Jesus' mother tongue may have been Aramaic, he said, but Aramaic was really not close to Hebrew. Aramaic is really closer to German. I'm sure that an argument like this. I mean, Odeberg was a great scholar, but I don't know how he could go from being involved in critical editions of the Mishnah to Sefta to going to this kind of thing. I don't know why. I mean, to be honest, what amazed me, apart from everything else, that Odeberg wrote letters in support of the denazification of some of the most notorious Nazis, who were themselves really stupid people who one wouldn't associate. Why was he on a first name, Dutzen basis with some of these people, such as Wolfmeier Erlach? You wouldn't spend 2 minutes with someone like Wolfmeier Erlach. He was an uneducated, rabble-rouser fool. So why would a man like Odeberg, who was so brilliant, spend time with this person? This I don't understand. And to defend him after the war and to try to help him get denazified, I don't understand it. At any rate, this institute flourished. They published their own version of the New Testament, purged of all Jewish references, a hymnal without any Hebrew. Of course, they got rid of the Old Testament, even though some people said, you don't have to get rid of the Old Testament. It's not really a Jewish book, because the prophets are always condemning Israel for its sins, so therefore it's an anti-Semitic book. That's how they defended the Old Testament. Very interesting. An argument, by the way, to keep in mind when looking at some people who were supposedly anti-Nazi or anti-Deutsche Christen or in the confessing church. Sometimes they brought that argument up. So they had their institute and their publications and so on. What's interesting to me in reading through the archives of their meetings, their conferences, their publications, they didn't talk very much about Aryan. What is it to be an Aryan? It must be a great thing for them. An Aryan, to be an Aryan is a great thing. They didn't talk, they worried about it. They worried about how Jews would somehow pollute Aryans, which I think, if the Aryans are so great, why should they be polluted so easily? But okay, they didn't think that. Sometimes it's terrible. You read this awful stuff for years and years, and sometimes I think to myself, why don't you make this argument? It's a better one. And I'm thinking, why am I making an argument? Anyway, so they come up with this with these arguments. But what's interesting is they dwell so much on what's Jewish. What's Jewish? Is this Jewish? Is that Jewish? Pharisees are Jewish. Is this argument, that the nature of this argument is Jewish? Their enemies would accuse them. For example, von Soden from Marburg, Hans von Soden from Marburg said, to make an argument that you have to de-Judaize Christianity, that's a Jewish way of thinking. That's Pharisaic. You see, even those who oppose them use this kind of argumentation, which is unbelievable to me. But, you know, it was so hard for them to get rid of the Jewish within Christianity. That was their problem. Every time they spoke about Christianity, they were reaffirming something Jewish, they realized. And then how do you get rid of it? How do you purge yourself? It was a constant problem. And I thought to myself, you know what this is? This is a kind of theological bulimia. You know, the bulimia, you know what that is? You eat and then you have, they're constantly taking in the Jewish and then trying to spit it out. It's like, okay. How can they get rid of it? That was their problem. And of course, after the war, many of these people continued to hold positions of power with an influence within the church as professors, as pastors. And there is let's say, a post-war era that also needs to be investigated. But I want to come to the other aspect of this, which is why theology would be attracted to racial theory. What is it about racism that made theologians so happy, excited? For one thing, for these theologians, racial theory seemed sophisticated and avant-garde. And they thought, you know, theology wasn't doing so well, people were not so enthusiastic about coming to church. This would make the church seem sophisticated, to be racist. So that might be one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is if you read racial writings, what are they worried about? They're not worried about the body, actually. That's not what they're talking about very much. The body is a marker of something, but it points you to something else. That is the moral and spiritual degeneracy, in this case of the Jews. And I'm mentioning this and talking about this because I want you to hear echoes of today and racial thinking today, which is not so much always pointed at Jews, but it may be pointed about other people, directed about Muslims or, in the United States, African Americans, and so forth. What racial writers, racist writers, were worried about was the moral and spiritual degeneracy of the Jews. It couldn't be contained, and it could easily affect and corrupt all of society. It could hurt the Aryans, too. Jews were morally degenerate, and the only way to preserve the morality of Germany, and of course this is what theologians worry about, is to get rid of these people. So for theologians reading racial writings, they felt there was an affinity. They're worried about morality, we're worried about morality. They're worried about the spiritual health of the Germans, we're worried about the spiritual health of the Germans. But there's one other element that I want to mention, and that is what's the relationship between morality and the body? If you think someone is morally corrupt, why are you worried about the body at all? What does it matter how the person looks? Why make these caricatures of the Jew with the big nose, for example? After all, the truth is, the nose itself is not dangerous. My nose isn't going to jump off my face and attack somebody. But rather, the argument is more subtle. It seems to me what they're saying is that the moral degeneracy that's so dangerous is inherent in the nose. It's not symbolized by the nose. It's inherent in the body. It's incarnate in the body, so to speak. That Jewish spirit that's so dangerous is incarnate in the body and can't be separated from it. So in some way, I also think that these theologians felt comfortable with racial theory because for them it was a kind of incarnational theology. And they could see that kind of affinity and feel comfortable with it. Now, I want to just say another word about how all of this looks from a Jewish perspective and then turn to some conclusions. You know, in the pre-modern period, Jews spoke about their uniqueness and difference from other people. They were different from others in all kinds of ways, different beliefs, different religious practices, different community, different sensibilities. And Jews were comfortable with being different. It wasn't a problem. In the modern period, we see something that's the opposite. Jewish self-understanding sees that Judaism's uniqueness is not its difference, but rather its universality. That is, what's important for some Jews, for example, who no longer believe that, let's say, that God revealed the Torah at Mount Sinai, that that's the basis of the greatness of the Torah, it's the Word of God. Those Jews who don't accept it nonetheless would say, but look at how the Torah, how Judaism has influenced the whole world. Even Christianity, even Muslims. It's the Jewish message. It's not exactly the same, but it comes from Judaism. So we're not worried so much about whether it's the Word of God, but we are worried about the power and influence of how Judaism is spread out over the world. It's the universality of Judaism, in other words, that's so important in the modern period, rather than the difference of Judaism, the uniqueness. So that in that sense, Judaism, and this is where we come to the role of Jesus, Judaism is no longer unique because of its distinctiveness as a religion, but because of its universalism, generating Christianity and Islam. And because it's generated those religions then, in some sense, are handmaidens. They become part of Judaism. They can be used to explain Judaism to other parts of the world. They are templates. Just as your child can be an example of what you can accomplish. Yes, look at what my child does. I did this. Not always. Yeah. Now this is also, in some sense, and I won't go into this, but I'll just mention, of course, this is the era of empire building. You know, we speak of the European nation states, fine, but these were also empires. Germany had an empire, France had an empire, Britain had an empire, and so on. So we also, when we read these texts, we should read them with an eye to the nature of the imperialist discourse in theology, not just Jewish theology, Christian theology as well. How does the imperialism, political imperialism of the era, come to be reflected in theological writings? Now, the alliance between Judaism and Islam, I think, has something to say to us as Jews and Christians also. And I just want to make a few concluding points about this. We might think about Judaism and Christianity as antiphonal religions. I can use the word antiphonal because many of you here are Christian. In the Jewish audience, they may not know the word so well, but you know what I mean. Christians speak of forgiveness, Jews speak of atonement. Different language, but they go together in some way. They're antiphonal. Christianity emphasizes itself as a religion of love. Jews like to refer to themselves as a religion of halakha, of Torah, of law, of ethical monotheism. Love, law. Depending how you use it, and sometimes it's not used the right way, as we all know from Christopher Stendhal, but still, each religion, we can say, makes a contribution to the balance. And we learn from each other. So I'll just mention, I went to a meeting with Michael Velko, who teaches theology at Heidelberg University. And he says, the Christians need the sanctifying presence of the divine biblical law traditions to bring in to their care for justice and mercy, the search for truth before God. But Christianity, in other words, and we have this, of course, from Professor Stendhal, Bishop Stendhal, Christianity cannot be based on love alone. Both justice and mercy, law and love are necessary for Jews as well as for Christians. The correlation of mercy and justice, mercy and justice together give us the morals of compassion that we need. Now, we know that for centuries Christians have denied the continued validity of Judaism as the will of God. But it's also clear that Judaism exists within Christianity. It's very clear, even if you try to get rid of it with a group of 60 theologians, they still couldn't do it. So Judaism continues to exist within Christianity. It isn't superseded in that sense. And for Christian theology to denounce or renounce Judaism, in that sense, is to cut off a piece of itself, to excise part of its own heart. To try to eradicate Judaism, whether it's through missionary efforts to convert Jews or through theological anti-Judaism, is self-destructive to Christians. So what would be left of the God of Israel if the people of Israel cease to exist? We know that can't work. How could Christianity survive the moral shame if Judaism were to be eradicated? I remember during the negotiations of the Second Vatican Council when Nostra Aetate was being formulated, and there was one proposal that came out of the deliberations that called for mission to the Jews, the hope for the eventual conversion of the Jews. And my father, who was a Jewish theologian in New York, but who was from Europe and got out of Europe only at the last minute, my father said, I would rather go to Auschwitz than give up my faith, which was a very frightening thing for me to hear as a small child. And at the same time, we might ask ourselves, if Judaism stands within Christianity, does Christianity stand within Judaism? Is there anything comparable? And indeed, we have to say that, after all, we Jews have shaped our understanding of Torah with an eye toward Christianity. Sometimes an apologetic eye, sometimes in response to a good idea. Although most Jews throughout the course of history have lived under Muslim rule rather than Christian rule, it's also true that Judaism never developed the fascination with Islam that it developed toward Christianity. Judaism has a fascination with Christianity. And there's so much of Christianity that's been internalized in Jewish teachings, whether it's the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of God, for instance, following the Virgin Mary, or it's the 10 Sfirot of Kabbalah that follow the Trinity in patterns of 3, or it's the Yortzeit candle lit on the anniversary of someone's death. There's so many elements, the Passover Haggadah written in response to certain Christian Eucharistic claims, for instance. Rabbis speak of Jews as living embodiments of Torah. The Jew as Torah incarnate. The Jew as Torah incarnate. Where did they get that idea? It's not from Christian theology. Much of the music of the synagogues also borrowed from churches, to say nothing of the weekly sermon that we didn't used to have, did we? We had sermons twice a year. Now we have a weekly sermon. And so much else in our liturgy. We sometimes define our religious observance with an eye to Christian polemics, so that when I come as a feminist and I criticize aspects of Jewish law, I worry, oh my goodness, do I sound like St. Paul? So there really is no independent theological tradition, because Judaism doesn't exist in isolation, even though sometimes it pretends. But it carries Christianity around in its head, a kind of looming presence that officially is supposed to be kept outside of the gates of Judaism to preserve the uniqueness and difference of Judaism, but historians have made it very clear that those gates are very open. They're not closed at all. It seems to me that Christianity has Judaism within, Judaism has Christianity without, surrounding it as a shell. But what do we say then about Islam? Islam seems to me to be our silent interlocutor. Islam, in some ways, has symbolized for some Jews the possibility of escaping the Jewish-Christian encounter. Forget about Christianity, we'll make our alliance with the Muslims. It hasn't worked, of course, but that was a hope for a while. For many Jews, Islam was the religion of tolerance within Judaism. Now, Judaism could exist. There was this golden age of Muslim Spain while the Christians persecuted the Jews. So Islam is the religion of tolerance, the good religion, the religion that likes us. Islam seemed to some Jews to fulfill what Judaism promised. Judaism promised monotheism. You really get it in Islam. In Judaism, of course, there's monotheism, but there's the Shekhinah, and there are the Sfirot, and so on. Pure and strict, no anthropomorphisms in Islam. And you go, of course, everybody's been to see those mosaics in Israel, from ancient Palestine, the mosaics from the synagogue floors with the astrological symbols. The strict and pure rejection of anthropomorphism was not there. For Christians, the invention of religion, which is really a 19th century European Protestant notion, with a large dose of colonialist attitudes, that notion of religion established an antagonism between law and religiosity, external action and internal devotion. And yet, for both Muslims and Jews, that kind of antagonism between religion and religious law and religiosity is meaningless. For Jews and for Muslims, the external and the internal are united and inseparable, even as Jesus is God and man in one. For Christians,
For Jews and for Muslims, the external acts and the internal devotion are one, united. So given the role of Islam as a kind of third voice in our dialogue, I wonder if we might think of it as a potential ally. That is, how can Islam help us as Jews and Christians have a better kind of dialogue, clarify, understand certain things better? Perhaps Islam can clarify the meaning of law, including Jewish law, as authentic religiosity, for Christians who think that only gospel can be God's word. And perhaps Islam might also encourage Jews to recognize the prophethood of those who brought God to other peoples, to Greeks and to Arabs. Jesus, Muhammad. Having the presence of a third voice, Islam, observing our dialogue, participating in the dialogue as Christians and Jews, might make us consider the ways in which we present our teaching. So, for example, the crucifixion is usually presented to Jews as a threat. You look at it, somebody said, it was Michael Wishergrad who said, I look at a crucifix and I think of Auschwitz. Jews look at the crucifixion and that's what they think of. Persecution, a threat. Look how you crucified our Lord. As Bishop Williamson restated just 2 weeks ago, by the way. The Holocaust didn't happen and the Jews killed Jesus. All the Jews. Even me, he said. All Jews to this day. Yeah? So there's a threat. You know who that is. The Catholic Bishop Williamson, who is now in Argentina, whom the Pope has refused to condemn. Okay, fine. The crucifixion has been presented to Jews as a threat. Look how you crucified our Lord. It's even been reenacted against us in the blood libel. It's been used as a spiritual threat, efforts to convert us to Christianity, rob us of our identity as Jews, our spiritual heritage. So we've known martyrdom for centuries in defense of our faith against Christian missionaries. Jews in Germany killed themselves and their children when the Crusaders came through the Rhineland rather than convert to Christianity. So the question is, how can the Christian message be presented to Jews without being a threat? And I wonder if Islam can help us with that, because Islam does not view Christianity as a threat, nor does it accept that the crucifixion killed Jesus. It has a different point of view, and perhaps we can modify some of our Jewish theological responses based on that. And at the same time, we Jews have to change the way we speak of the Christian message. Jews to this day, sometimes we'll see a sign at a synagogue, Rabbi so-and-so is going to speak this Friday night on Jewish views of Jesus. And sometimes I go because I know what I'm going to hear. I'm going to hear exactly what Geiger said 150 years ago. He's going to say the same thing, and he does. That's it. So the question is, can we say something other than this? Instead of repeating that Jesus said nothing new, that Paul invented a religion about him, or even that we continue saying that Islam is nothing more than Judaism for the Arab pagans. What can we do differently? One of the great tragedies of world history is that Christianity and Judaism have been such antagonists. My father once wrote that the children did not arise to call the mother blessed. Instead, they called the mother blind. A Jew, on the other hand, has to acknowledge the eminent role played by Christianity in God's design for the redemption of all people. Can we speak of Christianity in positive terms, as playing a role in the redemption that we long for as Jews? Perhaps we have to be more attentive to our many religious faiths as revealing the greatness of God's creation. Job says, "Stand still and consider the wondrous works of the Lord." Can we as Jews see Christianity, as well as Islam, like Judaism, as one of the wondrous works of the Lord? Yes, there are problems. There have been historically problems. Christians have problems to this day. Catholic Church has problems, at least in the United States. There have been some terrible things, and I think in Europe as well. Jews have problems also. We have problems in the state of Israel, and we know it. We all have problems. And Muslims also have problems. It's not enough, I sometimes go to these dialogues, to have a Muslim say, Islam is about peace. That's silly. Muslims have problems also. Let's recognize those problems and see what we can do to help one another, but not allow the problems to overshadow the fact that we are indeed, all of us, wondrous, wondrous creations of God. We human beings, my father used to say, will not perish for lack of information, but we may perish for lack of appreciation. Intellectual truth is wonderful, but of course, it's not sufficient. And hopefully we can also, as we study our history, also simultaneously cultivate our sense of the wonder of God's creation. Thank you very much.
My name is Kai Engelhardt. I'm coordinating a Catholic Commission for Interreligious Dialogue. I'm also on the board of the Association for Jewish-Christian Collaboration here in Stockholm. Apart from the Bishop Williamson gang and his people who think similarly to him, are there any modern parallels to what you told us about late 19th century, early 20th century ideas, these absurd ideas, racist and theological ideas today? That is my question.
So you're asking if there are parallels today to some of the racial ideas of the earlier part of the 20th century. Let's say I would approach that question both on a literal level, or I would also read your question in a more fluid fashion. I would say that when I first started going to Germany as a graduate student in the late 1980s, I encountered certain feminist writers, and I think you know some of these people. We talked about some of it yesterday, who were saying that Jesus was a feminist because no Jewish man in the first century would speak to a woman, no rabbi would speak to a woman, or women were treated so badly. So historically it was problematic, and then it was this kind of seesaw. If you can negate Judaism, you can elevate Christianity, and that was problematic. Rather than saying, as of course as Bishop Steno would say, what Jesus did, Jesus was Jewish, so what he did is what Jewish men did, what rabbis did. That's it. So that was also continuing a certain kind of theological tradition, but it went further and it said that the violence of the Nazis, this was an argument that was developed by Christa Bullock and also by Franz Alt in the book Jesus der erste Neumann, that was a bestseller in Germany. The Nazi violence was Jewish. The Nazis obeyed the commands of Hitler in an unthinking way, and they killed people. And where do you find this kind of blind obedience? It's Jewish morality. The Jews obey the commandments of God, the Nazis obey the commands of Hitler, so therefore Nazism and the Holocaust is a Jewish phenomenon, not a Christian phenomenon. And in a very concrete way, that's continuing Nazi-era arguments. I can give you more examples. I think that sort of thing has died out pretty much. But in a less concrete way, I would say some of the ways in which I hear Islam described, for example, reminds me very much of the way Judaism was described. And I'm talking now about the way Islam is described both by Jews and Christians today. So some of the ways, patterns of thinking continue. To say that Islam is essentially a violent religion, the same thing was said about Judaism. It's essentially a violent religion. They turn to passage in Maccabees about circumcision, Hasmoneans are violent, etc., etc. This is a very similar kind of...
But concerning Jews specifically.
Concerning Jews specifically. Yeah, there's still certainly supersessionist trends within Christian theology. And I would say that I am puzzled by the failure of the Pope to make a very clean, clear break with this Bishop Williamson. I don't understand it. It doesn't help. And sometimes I feel that I am a better friend to Catholicism than the Pope is.
You've spoken of the ways in which, regarding the last question, old images persist. What are some of the new ways of relationship between Christians and Jews that have unfolded in the last 40 years? Specifically, are there ways of mutuality and respect that are a new phenomenon?
You know, I'm happy to say, but do you have something in mind that you want to mention? Because let me just say that I'm also interested in what you have to say about what it is in Christianity that would be helpful to Judaism and vice versa. Go ahead.
I have the privilege to be here with my friend Rabbi Lazar, and we spent last week at a monastery in France, in Burgundy, called Taizé, praying with the brothers and the sisters. And that seems to me to be a new phenomenon Jewishly, the openness to pray together. And I also have experienced it, I'm from California, with Christian colleagues coming to my synagogue to be in our midst to pray with us. A quality of not only respect, but of opening ourselves to shared religious expression. That seems like a new phenomenon, and I'd like you to comment on it.
You know, I think it's very important, and I'm glad you mentioned that. And Taizé is a wonderful place, and I think there are, as you say, in other parts of the world. Can we pray together? And I think that goes back to this point. Is it possible for a Christian to learn something about God from a Jew? And that is a fairly new question, historically speaking. Certainly it was true 2,000 years ago. Christians learned about God from Jesus and other Jews. But I think the experience of that is something new. My impression of it is that it's post-World War II. I think that there is probably more on this. In these kinds of settings that you mentioned, there's more of Christians discovering Judaism than there are Jews discovering they can learn about God from Christians. I'm not sure, but I sometimes worry about it, but that may just be my own concern about my community. But can we learn about God from one another, and can we pray together? Indeed. That's very important, and I'm glad you mentioned that.
My name is Björn Hornberg, and I'm a layman in the Swedish Lutheran Church. I will ask you, there was some theology that's called replacement theology that emerged in the 2nd and 3rd century. What kind of influence do you think this replacement theology had? Have you heard about that?
Yeah, a little bit, but I really don't have a good answer for that. That's not my area. What impact replacement theology has had on this? If you mean more specific, if you mean more general term, you know, the whole history of the relationship of Christianity to Judaism is certainly multifaceted, and I wouldn't want to reduce it. And I did reduce it in my lecture quite a bit because there's so many other elements involved at the same time. You know, there's a new book by a friend of mine named Denise Buell. The book is called Why This New Race? And she notes that some early Christian writings use the term ethnos as a self-definition. In other words, that early Christians saw themselves as an alternative ethnic group or racial group, race group in a very loose sense, 2nd, 3rd century. That this is in the sense that there are Jews who are like this, Christians who are like this. Her argument is that the notion of a distinction between Jewish particularism and Christian universalism is actually a modern idea and does not apply to antiquity. So rather than Christians saying we are the new universal message, overcoming the particular message of Judaism, they're saying we are an alternative particular group. So that's from a historian arguing about early Christian self-understanding, but with a lot of implications theologically for us, even for today. Let me just give you that as a response, which is not... do you want to say a word about that?
Thank you. No, that's good.
I'm Anders Hjeltman from Uppsala. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I like your question about what Christianity can learn from Judaism, because it's very interesting the fact that because the Christian exegesis after the Holocaust has really concentrated very much following also in the wake of Christer Stendahl in showing the Jewishness of Christianity. But when we come to systematic theology, I mean the place where you really formulate theology, it really doesn't have very much impact. So if you compare exegesis, the study of the Bible, and systematic theology, you will see there's a great gap between it. So it's like in Christian theology, the process has not come yet in furthering the results from exegesis into systematic theology. I don't know where it would end up, but I think it's a very interesting phenomenon that we haven't seen this development yet.
That's interesting. Thank you. Thank you for the comment. I appreciate it. I know that Marquardt was very concerned about developing a Christology common to Judaism.
Susannah, I wanted to thank you so much for this, and I did want to say, as a parish pastor, that I'm very conscious that many of these attitudes, the anti-Judaic assumptions and way of thinking, do persist in our popular Christianity, that I do still hear, not within my own congregation, but fairly often in the church, people saying things like, well, I believe in a New Testament God, not an Old Testament God. That kind of Marcionism is very much present. And people who say, well, Jesus called God Abba, and of course Jews wouldn't do that. That sort of thing. So it is, the problem persists, and it's built in very deeply, I'm afraid. But I so much appreciated what you said about can we, as Christians and Jews, learn about God together, and can we pray together? One of the things that I think was a particular contribution of my father's was his attention to the way that language functions. Much of his breakthrough with Paul was an attention to hermeneutics and how does the language function. And he said, for example, when people asked about science and religion, he said, well, you know, the Bible is not science minus, it's poetry plus. And he spoke of it as love language. So much of the Bible is love language. And his famous saying, how can I sing my love song to Jesus without belittling those who don't? And it seems to me that that's where, if we can have that kind of conversation where we can be particular and we can be different, and we can have a conversation that does not belittle the views of the other, but where we discover that, well, we talk about much the same things. Christian sacramentalism is a kind of insistence that this faith is not just in the mind, but it's in the body, it's in the blood. And the whole idea that the difference between Judaism and Christianity is that somehow Judaism is a religion of genetics and Christianity is a religion of faith, well then, what are we saying when we say that we as Christians are in the body of Christ and that we share the same blood? You know, and how is that particularism different from tribalism? And how can we say, you Jews, you struggle with this, and we struggle with this, and how helpful it is. The third thing that I really appreciated in what you had to say was to have that conversation in what my father used to call the larger ecumenism, not just between the two of us as the traditional antagonists, but to have that conversation as a conversation that takes place in the presence of and with the help of and with the challenge of Muslims. It's got to be better. Except that some of those who want to have that conversation really don't want to have the conversation. They want to have, let's the two of us gang up on you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I also, as we know, sometimes these discussions between Jews and Christians are really discussions between liberals. And the hardest thing is to get together with those who are, what should I say, my Jewish friends who are very orthodox, politically very right-wing, and to have that kind of conversation. That's very hard. And sometimes it might be easier if somebody attended, somebody participated who was not Jewish. I imagine it, that perhaps there would be more sense of self-reflection, that perhaps one, I can't say this really, can I? I can't really think this. This is really not good. Not because there's the presence of the outside world, and it's not an internal discussion. So thank you very much for that comment. I appreciate it. It's wonderful.
Morton Arrow, Chief Rabbi Emeritus. I think we're making some confessions here, and I think maybe it's a good thing that we are doing so, with the impossibility of theology and the fact that we have many of our old biases that are still with us. I think that in Jewish terms, if I can speak for myself, but I think I speak for many, many Jews, our problem with Christianity and to a lesser degree with Islam is the persecution of the past, the heavy history that we bear with us, a history which, as you see somewhat on the top, the mission befouling, the order, the compulsion of the mitzvah in Christianity of converting the world, which means that we're always suspect when we meet Christians who have collars or whatever they may be. Are they really interested in me, or are they interested in saving my soul? There are many of these remnants of the past that remain in the present, and our recent history does nothing to eliminate it. Now that we're confessing, just like as I don't think we're touching theology, I don't know all of our efforts, and I pray with Christians, and I'm very active in the organization that Kai is involved in, and many things of this sort. At the same time, the history is so heavy. When we got back from Rome, and we saw St. Peter's, and we saw all of this heavy anti-Jewishness built in, and then we want to make a new thing on the top. Where do we start?
Part of the problem of writing history is that we write history around exciting moments of great change, moments of conflagration. There's more written about the history of a war than the history of the few years of peace before and after. And so the result is, when we look at the history, as Jewish history came to be written, especially Heinrich Gretz, 11-volume History of the Jews in the 19th century, was a history that went from one moment of persecution to the next. And it's very much of a lachrymose history, a history of Jewish victimization, and a history is primarily victimization at the hands of Christians. Of course, what he neglected was the fact that there were also very long stretches without persecution. That there were those who were antagonistic and those who were friends. So, for example, while it's true that Jews were expelled here and there throughout the land, the principalities of what came to be known as Germany. At the same time, Jewish women were the midwives, Christian women were the wet nurses. There was an intimacy in the relationship. A wet nurse lived in the home of a Jewish family, lived there, and rabbis actually said it was permissible for her to keep her non-kosher food in the house, whatever it took. And that kind of intimate relationship also existed. We've had a tendency for a long time to focus on the persecutions. We have a lachrymose calendar of the Jewish year. There are an awful lot of weeks where you can't have a wedding, you can't have a celebration, you have to be miserable. I think perhaps one thing we might do is to change that. And to have a bit more celebration and happy times in Jewish life. and extend that spirit a bit and rewrite the history so that, yes, it's true that Jews were put in ghettos in Italy in the 16th century, but it was also at the same time when a lot of other groups were ghettoized, when the walls of convents and monasteries were thickened and raised even higher, and society was segregated. And this was, in fact, the era of the Counter-Reformation. And in fact, Rome was very nervous about a lot of things, legitimately so. We weren't the only ones. When we read a narrative of Jewish history, we trace only the persecutions, but in certain periods it wasn't about being a Jew that led to this persecution. Everybody was being persecuted at that same time. So that gives a different nuance to the moment, and it might change our self-perception as Jews. Yeah? It's true, the Holocaust was one of the most extraordinarily horrific moments in the history of humanity, and we're still dealing with what it all could possibly mean in every level, philosophically, artistically, theologically, and so on. But we can't allow this to dominate everything that's happened in the course of Jewish history, because it wasn't a Holocaust every day. It was a psalm every day that we as Jews sang. And let's not lose sight of that we sang a psalm every day.
My name is Sebastian Sylvain, and I'm active in the Jewish community here in Stockholm. I was thinking about what you said as engaging as partners in dialogue. There is a problem of that these aren't two, if you're talking about Judaism and Christianity, these aren't two equals meeting up on common ground. I would say that there is a David and there is a Goliath, and when it comes to Christianity learning from Judaism, there's, I started that in another end. When it comes to Judaism learning from Christianity, there's always this fear of getting too influenced by Christianity, what you said about Gothic architecture in synagogues, that you don't want to bring it too close to your heart because it might dissolve you. But then there's the other fear from Jewish circles that Christianity would sort of colonize Judaism by getting too close to it, by getting too close to Talmud, by using the Talmud, by getting into Buber, by getting into Abraham Joshua Heschel, that they would sort of steal it from Judaism and make it Christian. They sort of try and colonize it because it's such a huge religious force in comparison to Judaism, which is a very small one. And do you see that there's a sort of double fear of don't let them get too close to us and don't let them get our stuff? Is there some way around that reasoning that I think sort of pops up every now and then?
Yes, I think it's a very important point, actually, that might be on a concrete level. One could say, look at all the churches that celebrate Passover Seders. And they say, well, it's in the Gospels, the Last Supper, Passover Seder, why shouldn't it be part of Christian church community as well? And you wonder, is that an affirmation of Judaism, or is that, what do you say, Vereinnahmung in English? Vereinnahmung is it's a kind of appropriation, taking into oneself, another kind of supersessionism, taking it away from. I mean, for example, I might say, well, I feel like making the Eucharist, and so I'll do it. It can be offensive to take over somebody else's religious practice. It makes it into a game, into something performative. But at the same time, as we discussed earlier, I think Judaism is also a mimetic religion. There's a lot of performativity in Judaism that at times feels artificial. We are being Jewish the way our grandparents were Jewish, for example, which my father called spiritual plagiarism, by the way. And so how do we avoid spiritual plagiarism? And how do we avoid an appropriation of somebody else? And that is indeed a problem. Now, I would say, on the one hand, that yes, Christianity is mightier than Judaism, historically, in all kinds of ways. On the other hand, David did defeat Goliath. And we know from very concrete examples that sometimes a guerrilla army, guerrilla warfare can defeat a great military power. Look at the United States and Vietnam, for instance, and that's how I grew up. So, in fact, I don't feel that the great military power that lumbers in is necessarily going to conquer, and swagger around the way some of our Republican presidents did. So I think some of it depends on the attitude. It's not necessarily about the power. I'm not worried about being colonized right now. I do think that this question that you asked about this boundary issue is something that we do need to negotiate and talk about, but it's something to be discussed in a public forum. That is this an affirmation or is this an appropriation when we come together? And what about boundaries? And do we want to speak of boundaries? Is there such a thing, in fact? Is that perhaps a wrong concept? I just mentioned in the 19th century, one of the problems for liberal Protestants and liberal Jews was that they were so close, they got nervous. Where does one end and the other begin? I had a student, she told me her mother's Jewish, her father's Christian. They said, you choose which religion you want. So she went to church, she went to synagogue. She says to me, I can't tell the difference. They're all the same. The rabbi, the minister, they get up and they say the most important thing is the family. It's in platitudes, yeah. And then I bet, yeah. Okay, so where do you draw the line? Well, maybe the lines have to be thought of in a different way. Maybe boundaries isn't really the way to think about this in a postmodern era. Maybe there is something fluid that needs to be considered in this relationship. But again, I'm not as convinced that Christian hegemony exists in a dangerous fashion today in the way we used to think of it. I don't think it's the same as it was in the 19th century, and that the discourses of imperialism are not the same. I think there are other kinds of problems that we have, and one of them is, how do we help each other when we see the other one is in a big mess? Christianity has real problems, theological problems, and as anti-Judaism is a problem. I feel sorry. I had a friend once in the dorm at Harvard Divinity School, my first year, who came from Calvin College, and he was very, very conservative. And he had never met a Jew. There were a lot of them in those days. He never met a Jew, and he liked me. He had a crush on me. And he invited me to have coffee with him. And as we left Divinity Hall, which was a great dorm, and we started walking to Harvard Square, he said, how can you be Jewish after the Holocaust? Don't you think God is trying to tell you something? And I said, how can you be Christian after the Holocaust, after what you did? And he was just startled to have such a, I felt sorry for him. This is how you talk? This is how you think? What kind of a theological mentality does such a person have? He's got a problem. I felt sorry. Really felt sorry for him. So I think that there are problems. And we have problems too. We have problems in our Jewish community with certain political tendencies in this community. Political tendencies that are expressed not only in Israel but elsewhere as well, that are very problematic, as we all know. It's a crisis for us, and we need help too. We don't need just condemnation, just like Christians don't need Jews condemning them for anti-Judaism and saying, oh, it's intrinsic, it's the left hand of Christology, blah, blah, blah. No, everybody needs a little compassion. How do you get out of this? How do we change? We have problems. We have political problems in the state of Israel, and believe me, in the United States and the Jewish community also. Very serious problems. What does it mean? What is this state? What are we trying to do here? What kind of a state is this? And what are we doing to Palestinians? Where do we hope to be in 50 years? This is a terrible situation that's going on. So I think we need to help each other and think of it in those terms in some way. So thank you for the comment.
Well, all good things have to end. And our time here in this room is ended now. It seems like, the day is ended too. That is almost night. But this is the way that it is in Sweden at this time of the year. It's not the best time to visit Sweden. Although it's better now. This November is the best November we've had for ages. So imagine how it could be. But in here, we are embraced by psalms, actually. There are psalm quotations written here up at the near the ceiling. So that we are embraced in here. Now we will continue just outside this room. There are some refreshments, white and red wine that is kosher. And we can continue our discussions there. And again, Professor, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us this lecture and this knowledge that you have. Thank you.